Hi, Ozzy here. This is a follow-up video to respond to some interesting comments and questions about my last video, which was about teleological versus teleonomic design. If you've not seen that one, please view that video first. Otherwise, this one might not make a lick of sense to you. And I'll include the link below this video. In this particular video, though, I want to address a few concerns that came up more than once in the comments about that last video, specifically about what sorts of things count as or qualify as teleonomically designed objects or systems. What makes something teleonomically designed? Also, some people question the legitimacy of using the word design at all when describing organismal traits which have been caused or produced by naturalistic processes, because they felt that the term design should be used only to describe things produced teleologically, that is, intentionally, deliberately by a conscious and purposive agent. Here are a few examples from the comments section. One person asked, quote, "What would not count as design then? Is the solar system a teleonomic design, or say the Earth's water cycle?" End quote. Another person expressed a similar concern about where to draw that line between things which have natural causes and things which are naturally caused, but can be said to be teleonomically designed. This person wrote, "An argument I've been trying to elaborate is comparing a brick with a geode." A geode, for those who might not know, is a natural rock formation. It's typically spherical, but it's hollow inside. When you crack it open, it has a beautiful, intricate crystalline structure. So one is man-made, the brick, designed for a purpose. The other one just is. The geode is far more complex than the brick and even shows some beautiful designs as in visual patterns. However, the geode is definitively not teleologically designed, and I'm not sure it could be considered teleonomically designed either. End quote. Good point, and I hope I'll be able to answer that. And finally, another person challenged the entire concept of teleonomy as redundant, using a familiar analogy many of us have heard and used when trying to explain evolution by natural selection to those unfamiliar with the concept. And this person wrote, quote, "I'm going to disagree with the utility of the term teleonomic design. In my mind, life adapts to fill niches the same way fluids alter their shape to fill a container. Is water poured into an oddly shaped glass designed to fill the glass?" End quote. Great point, and I'll have quite a bit to say about that. So, before getting into the meat of what is and is not teleonomically designed and whether we should even use the word design when it comes to evolved biological traits and features, it's perhaps worth reminding ourselves why people ever thought organisms and their traits were teleologically designed, that is, intentionally designed by some intelligent agent. For millennia, humans have regarded biological adaptations as paradigm examples, the best possible examples of designed objects and systems found in nature. And it's just as important to note that people weren't inclined to think that everything around them was designed. People may have thought gods or a god created everything, but they didn't go around thinking everything looked designed. They didn't look at a mountain range and think, I wonder what designed that. They certainly wondered how the mountain got there, of course, and they may have imagined that some immensely powerful being was the only thing capable of producing a mountain. But they didn't go around wondering why the mountain was designed or why it was designed the way it is. They didn't think it was designed. People in general didn't think that everything in existence was designed or had purposes. But people did look at organisms and saw, for instance, that eyes served the purposes of seeing. Indeed, they recognized that all senses and perceptual systems in organisms serve an organism's need to know what's happening around it, to track changes around it, to model reality in some way so that they can behave appropriately to changing circumstances around them. People could plainly see that sensory organs and systems serve perceptual needs of the organism. People recognize that a bird's wing and a bat's wing and a moth's wing, despite being very different in how they do so, all obviously serve the purpose of flight, contributing to the organism's more general locomotive interests, which in turn function well for helping those organisms find nourishment and mates and shelter and avoiding predation and so forth. People noted that certain highly salient coloration patterns on a venomous snake made it easy to identify and recognize and remember, and this served to discourage predators from attacking it, even though it made it more visible, not less, a feature we call aposematic warning coloration today. Similarly, people could see that one species sometimes mimicked another species' appearance, invariably a deadly or unpalatable species, and this reduced the mimic's chances of being eaten by a predator by appearing to be an undesirable choice for the predator. They also noted examples of exquisite camouflage in many organisms, permitting these organisms to go unnoticed by the predators. The number of such manifestly environment-suited traits and features in the world of living things was beyond counting, and placed them in a category apart from natural features such as the shape of a mountain or the patterns one finds in ocean waves. And without any good theory or account of how any of these organisms could have come to be so well suited to their circumstances, or even existed without them, people inferred that these admirable designs were always present and thus had to be explained by an intelligent designer. So it's important to remember that people didn't think that these things were designed because they happened to believe that there were gods. No, rather, they thought the gods were responsible for making these creatures with these particular traits because these traits were clearly designed as they saw it. Now, by our lights, they were mistaken. But they weren't being irrational. There was no better explanation on offer. We have the benefit of Darwin and Wallace's brilliant insights and discovery of the principle of natural selection, a teleonomic process which can, in principle, account for how organisms have acquired traits which have manifest functions and purposes to the organisms in their local environments. So for millennia, humans have regarded biological adaptations as paradigm examples of designed objects and systems. The fact that we've only recently discovered a naturalistic explanation for things long regarded as designed is not, all by itself, a reason to evacuate all those paradigm examples from under the heading of design. Rather, science has revealed that there is more than one way for something to be designed, including by unintended naturalistic causes. But suppose we just decide to insist that the word design will be used strictly to refer to teleology, that is, to intentional, deliberate, purposive designs produced by a purposer. We're still going to need a term or an expression to describe all the sorts of cases, such as the ones I just listed moments ago, which we might otherwise see as teleologically designed, but now regard as non-teleological. What shall we call these things? How shall we refer to these things which otherwise appear designed? Pseudo-designed? Seem to be designed? Maybe teleonomically produced or teleonomic effects? Strictly speaking, nothing hinges on whether we use the word design or not. What matters here is we need and want some way of picking out or referring to things which look teleological but aren't teleological, but nevertheless have genuine functions, serve actual interests to the organism, and so have a real purpose to the thing that has those features. There are parts of the natural world, in other words, namely certain features of living organisms, which appear teleological but aren't, and which are genuinely serving interests, have functions, and so have purposes for the system in question. And they aren't teleological, but they aren't the same as inanimate systems either. And this is what the expression teleonomic design picks out. But, you might be thinking, isn't there a danger here of broadening the concept of design so much that everything suddenly falls under the heading of design, rendering it meaningless because on such a lax and open definition of design, everything under the sun, everything that has naturalistic causes would be considered design? No. Nothing in the concept of teleonomy implies that volcanoes and stars, the solar system, galaxies, the water cycle, geodes, puddles of water filling a pothole, and other inanimate objects and systems are designed. The claim here is not that everything which has changed over time is the result of a long causal process, such as a volcano or solar system, is designed. That's not the claim. Nor is it the claim that every system where there is a predictable and physically explicable fit between the system and its surroundings, like the puddle and how it perfectly fits at the pothole it's in, that's designed. No, that's not the claim either. Nor is it the claim that whatever exhibits striking and beautiful regularities or patterns, such as a geode, is designed. No. Rather, the claim is that something is rightly said to be designed when the object or system in question has interests which can be served, that these features or traits serve a function toward that object's interests. And the presence of the interest-serving features forms part of the causal explanation for why the system has acquired those features. A puddle of water in a pothole has many interesting features, including the way the water fits the pothole it's sitting in perfectly. But the water has no interest. That puddle has no interest, and certainly has no interest which can be served by fitting or not fitting the vessel it happens to be sitting in. How well or poorly the water fits the pothole or the bottle or whatever doesn't help us understand or explain why water has the shape-conforming properties that it has and continues to have as those properties. The water's capacity to perfectly conform to the shape of its vessel in no way explains why water has that property. Indeed, water always had that property. It doesn't have that property because some advantage is conferred to water the more perfectly it conforms to its vessel. Similarly, the solar system is not made better off or worse off by having different features than the ones it has. Nor does a solar system, despite there being all sorts of pattern and order and regularity and even beauty about it, have any interests which are served by its having a certain shape or properties. It doesn't matter if a solar system is big or small, beautifully symmetrical and orderly or highly irregular. None of those properties serve a solar system's interests because they have no interests. And as such, no matter the shape, size, or constitution of a solar system, those features don't help to explain why it has the features that it does. If a solar system gains new planets or loses a few, doesn't make it a better solar system, because a solar system isn't in the business of doing anything. It can't be better at anything, and nothing about a solar system is for anything. No part of a solar system serves a purpose or a function to the rest of the solar system, or anything else for that matter. It just is what it is and does what it does. But in the case of some systems, namely living organisms, which are in the business of replication, though not consciously, and so have reproductive interests, their morphological and behavioral features are directly related to, indeed dependent upon, how successfully they conduce to reproductive fitness. And most importantly of all, it is that fact which explains why subsequent members of that population inherit the traits and features which they end up with. So there are three criteria here required for something to be teleonomically designed. First, the system must have interests or needs. Second, the system must have features which serve the interests and needs of the system, thus having functions for the system. And third, the execution of those interest-serving functional features is part of the causal explanation for how the system has come to have those features, such that counterfactually, or if it were otherwise, if they did not serve those functions, the features would not be predicted to exist in their present form. No feature or characteristic of a mountain is better or worse at anything that is of explanatory relevance as to why the mountain has the features that it does. A mountain shape doesn't make it a better or worse mountain. It can be better from our perspective as a ski slope, but that fact doesn't explain why the mountain is or has the shape that it has, or made of what it is, or anything else about the mountain. No feature of a mountain serves a mountain's interests, and a mountain has no interest to serve in any case. Now, consider eyes. The specific features present or absent in an eye or the features are directly relevant to how well eyes satisfy an organism's perceptual needs relative to its environment. And this isn't some sort of subjective judgment or evaluation on our part. How well an eye functions at seeing in a given environment, or how suitable a body shape is to moving efficiently through water or air, is an objective fact quite independent of our judgment or subjective evaluation. These are objective facts about the physical natural world. Some eyes see better than others. Some shapes are more hydrodynamic or aerodynamic than others. And such facts are relevant to why some organisms left more surviving offspring than others. And so these facts are relevant to explaining why we find the types of traits and the distribution of traits that we do in the organismal world. So for those reasons, volcanoes, solar systems, the water cycle, geodes, the fact that a puddle of water shape perfectly fits the hole it's sitting in, none of these are examples of teleonomic designs. There are no interests, no needs involved in these objects and systems. None of the features of these things serve a function to the system or object itself, and hence have no purpose to these systems or explain why the system acquired and continues to have the features which it does. Functions and purposes are irrelevant to explaining these phenomena. But in the biological world, we find systems which have reproductive interests, from which follow other interests, needs, and functions and purposes, all of which are relevant in explaining why the organisms have the features that they do. So I hope that helps clarify the notion of teleonomic design somewhat, and helps people see why not every naturalistic explanation is a teleonomic design explanation. Teleonomic design explanations are all naturalistic, but not all naturalistically explained phenomena are explicable in terms of teleonomic design. Now, no one is legislating how you should speak and how you must use the word design, especially in common parlance. In the world of human-manufactured objects and systems, the word design does refer to teleology. But in the field of biology and evolutionary biology in particular, the word design was and is used unproblematically. I mentioned in my last video that Richard Dawkins and Stephen Jay Gould and others used the word without apology, knowing full well that outside of evolutionary biology the term connotes teleology. But evolutionary ecologists talk about design quite casually, without concern, in the same way that scientists in general use the word theory, even though within their discourse the word theory denotes something different than what the public at large thinks it means. Evolutionary ecologists will, when discussing possible evolutionary pathways by which a trait evolved, ask questions such as, what selective pressures do you think led to this design? Or they'll ask what the design constraints are on flight when talking about analogous evolved traits such as the wings of birds, bats, and insects, which are understood to have evolved separately in different animal lineages. That's just how they talk. They use the word design. They will even argue with one another vehemently about whether or not a trait or feature is genuinely a designed adaptation at all, or perhaps the result of a non-teleonomic process, a non-designing, non-adaptation producing mechanism of evolution. There are many such mechanisms that are non-design producing, non-adaptive, such as pleiotropy, meiotic drive, genic selection, founder effects, or genetic drift. Evolutionary ecologists recognize that some evolutionary mechanisms are adaptive, design-producing forces, and some are not. But let's consider another example of a word which used to be considered as essentially implying a mind and a planner, but which is now used unproblematically by biologists to refer to mindless causal factors. Consider the word selection. In ordinary parlance, the word selection also implies an agent who is doing the selecting, just like design does. Indeed, one sometimes hears creationists today make that very point when they scoff at the expression natural selection and ask, who is doing the selecting? As they see it, the word selection implies an agent, a mind, someone who is discriminating and distinguishing and choosing. And so they imagine that when evolutionists speak of natural selection, they're either being sloppy in their language or else they must be illicitly personifying nature, treating Mother Nature as some conscious being doing some sort of choosing based on her preferences. Now, prior to Darwin, the word selection was used in the restrictive way some present-day creationists suggest that we use it. People back then did think selection was a conscious process. Indeed, Darwin chose the expression natural selection precisely on the analogy of what the term artificial selection meant, conscious choice. Fortunately, most people came to understand Darwin's point that the environment does select. Not consciously, of course, but rather the way a screen or a filter sorts objects by size. Should we cease to speak of natural selection because in common parlance, even today, the word selection suggests a conscious agent who is sorting and choosing? Of course not. The word selection is perfectly apt, despite the fact that it violated and still violates many people's pre-theoretical linguistic intuitions about what is suggested by the word selection. Darwin rightly recognized that nature, the totality of local environmental pressures affecting and determining an organism's comparative fitness, constitutes a selective standard. Nature is not consciously selecting, but it still sorts the fit from the unfit, the fitter from the less fit. Nature is a selector. It's just not a conscious selector. But so what if it's not conscious? And this violates some linguistic intuitions based on how we're used to employing the word in ordinary parlance. Nature is still, in fact, selecting, just doing it by a completely different process, one requiring no mind. There are no intended and prior criteria or goals in natural selection, as there is in the case of deliberate, purposive selection by a conscious pet breeder trying to accentuate or suppress certain traits in a dog or pigeon. But the result is still a predictable sorting process that determines the trait frequencies of the population in the subsequent generation. Nature doesn't have a selective standard. It constitutes one. It is a selective standard, the standard against which an organism's reproductive fitness can be measured and predicted. All that mental stuff, the criteria and the goals which form part of what we mean by what we now call agent selection, that's just irrelevant in natural selection. Selection doesn't have to be an intentionalistic term. Today, we speak of agent selection versus natural selection, where we used to just speak of selection, just as we now have analog watches and digital watches, where we used to simply speak of watches. And similarly, the meaning of design is no longer exhausted by the concept of teleology. We've discovered teleonomic processes, purely naturalistic causes to explain biological designs which were once naively presumed to be teleological designs. It took some time, but at least our dictionaries now reflect this new usage of the word selection, so that one can now find, even in ordinary dictionaries, not just technical dictionaries of biological terminology, we can now find the word selection listed with a definition that describes natural selection. This only happened, however, because the term natural selection came to be very widely discussed by the public. And that was because that was a key term in the Darwinian explanation of evolution. By contrast, the word design is not some piece of well-specified jargon in Darwin's theory, so not very well discussed. But people in the field use the word design without concern when speaking among themselves, and they understand that they're not using it teleologically at all, but teleonomically, a fact which leads to some confusion when they're speaking to people unfamiliar with the theory. But this confusion won't go away if ordinary proponents of evolutionary theory act like they're allergic to the word design. So you can, if you wish, insist on the vernacular usage of design, ignoring how biologists in fact use the term. But that's rather like people who, generations ago, tried to argue that evolutionists were misapplying the word selection when they spoke of natural selection. Or similarly, that the word adaptation implies a conscious agent adapting something or itself for some purpose. Evolutionary biology is replete with teleological and intentional idioms, precisely because evolutionary theory seeks to explain those very features of the natural world which are genuine designs, natural designs produced by natural processes. And being designed, they look, superficially, teleological. A teleological vocabulary had been used to refer to those features from time immemorial. And so that's the vocabulary which has been pressed into service in biology. And in that particular discourse, those words, today, refer to and explain and describe teleonomic designs. The last issue I want to address was expressed in this comment, which I'm abbreviating here. Quote, sure, organisms are designed by the process of evolution, but that doesn't make it a good idea to use design in our language. It may be the correct usage, but it doesn't make it an effective way to communicate. And later this person added, what I'm asking is it the most effective way to communicate the intended idea? Speaking over the heads of your audience is a fantastic way of miscommunicating, end quote. I completely agree that one should avoid talking over people's heads, especially deliberately talking over people's heads. However, it's important that we not divest ourselves of the analytical tools that we need to help people recognize an important and unobvious distinction to avoid a common equivocation and a faulty conclusion. After all, there are other scientific issues where people equivocate and we don't hesitate to correct them by pointing out an important distinction that they're failing to recognize. Consider how people routinely confuse speed with rate, or equivocate between mass and weight. Sometimes, having the right words is all it takes to help us keep a distinction straight in our minds and avoid semantic pitfalls. The fact that the words teleology and teleonomy are fancy sounding words is not a reason to avoid using them. We shouldn't balk at the terms teleology and teleonomy just because we're afraid of sounding like we're putting on pseudo-intellectual airs. There is always the risk that introducing a new term, especially an unfamiliar one, will confuse matters. But in this instance, the matter is already confused. There is already present in the discourse between creationists and evolutionists a huge conceptual confusion when creationists assume that any acknowledgement of design in the biological world is some sort of tacit admission of a teleological designer. The failure by many proponents of evolution to recognize the false identification of design with teleology is precisely how some proponents of evolution have convinced themselves that they should deny the existence of design for fear that if they admit that eyes are for seeing, they'll be painting themselves into a corner and be forced to accept an intelligent designer. In running away from the word design, they appear silly, unwilling to accept the simple fact that eyes exist for vision and ears for hearing, and so are denying the very features that natural selection so ingeniously explains without teleology. The solution to such equivocations is to first understand for oneself, then for the benefit of others, that the concept design isn't exhausted by teleology, since there's another kind of design we know exists, teleonomy. We need to up our game in these discussions, and possessing the relevant vocabulary keeps us from falling into semantic traps and helps us point out to people who are on the fence exactly what is question-begging about how creationists use the slogan, every design implies a designer. We shouldn't restrict our vocabulary out of fear that people will be put off by big words. That just dumbs down the discourse. So long as you're taking pains to explain your meaning, you're not bamboozling and you're not obfuscating. You're raising their consciousness and the level of discourse. All right, that's it. Thanks for all your feedback. I greatly appreciated it, and I welcomed it, and I look forward to more. And thank you for watching. Now, no one is legislating how you should speak and how you must use the word design, especially in common parlance. In the world of human manufactured objects and systems, the word design does refer to teleology. But in the field,